Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum is on the air.
Good evening. This is Dr. Dan, and this is Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum Live, streamed every Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube, Facebook, X, and Rumble. Tonight, climate change is the biggest hoax since the Cardiff Giant. I realize not everyone knows what the Cardiff Giant was, but it was a huge hoax several hundred years ago. Climate change hysteria is an international scam by the global elite to steal our money, amass power, and destroy America so they can rule the world. And their facade of lies is starting to crumble and collapse. Now, the entire sting that they created was based on science so fake that even a caveman would know it was fake. Carbon dioxide is not a poison gas. It is essential for all life on Earth. And I will show you that right now.
This was covered in third grade science class. All living creatures, humans and animals, breathe oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. All living plants take carbon dioxide in and put out the oxygen that we breathe. If carbon dioxide gets too low, all plants will die. If all plants die, all humans and animals will starve to death. Carbon dioxide is not a poison gas. It's essential for all life on Earth.
Well, the endangerment finding is a 2009 determination by the EPA that greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide pose a threat to public health and welfare. That allowed the bureaucrats of the agency to regulate these gas emissions under the Clean Air Act. And we know once bureaucrats get their toes, fingers, and claws into something, they never let go. Repeal of the endangerment finding by the EPA would remove the legal basis for regulating greenhouse gas emissions. And you know how important that would be. Some of these other examples of the crumbling facade of climate change: Pennsylvania's Democrat Governor Josh Shapiro was recently forced to withdraw from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. That is a cap and trade program which was aimed at reducing carbon emissions from power plants. And another one, New York's Democrat Governor Kathy Hochul was forced to agree to a natural gas pipeline project promoted by President Trump. More nations are now acting for financial self-preservation by opting out of rules and regulations that paralyze their economic futures and destroy the quality of life of their citizens. The arrogant elite, hidden under the clothes of fake science like the fairy tale emperor, are now revealed to be naked and afraid for all to see. Now, my guest on Freedom Forum Live is Kevin Mooney, journalist, author, and investigative reporter for the Commonwealth Foundation in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Currently, he is writing insightful articles for Restoration News. He is also the author of a new book, hopefully coming out in February, I understand, called Climate Porn: How and Why the Anti-Population Zealots Fabricate Science While Targeting American Capitalism, Freedom, and Independence. So, Kevin and I am very proud to say, are working together on several projects related to these words that I have spoken and other things as well. So, Kevin Mooney, welcome as a guest on Freedom Forum Radio.
Being on your show and having an opportunity to interact with your a broad cross section of Americans and like-minded libertarian thinkers. So I really appreciate everything that you put into circulation.
Well, so lots of things are going on, are they not, in this whole area? What I would like to know is they just had this big climate change meeting down in Brazil, the COP20, and I understand people were coming home with not happy looks on their face. Is that not true?
Yeah, they're up to, like, I guess it's COP 30, which means I guess the other 29 didn't quite cut the mustard. These are the United Nations international climate conferences that go back to the early 1990s. I think that movement reached its peak with the Paris Climate Agreement, which was forged right before COVID broke. Now that the U.S. has gotten out of Paris for the second time, I think it's finally dying on the vine. And if you go back and look at this COP30 conference, they came out with these declarations to have a unified statement on the challenges of climate change, sort of vacuous and without any teeth to it. Somebody else who was missing at that conference was Al Gore. He's been supplanted by Gavin Newsom, the new climate star, because California seems to be the outlier inside the entire country. I think the movement has passed its peak. It still has money and organization behind it, but there was nothing palpable coming out of the meeting. I think Paris gave them a little bit of momentum for a period of time to try to lock down American industry. And as you say, put the globals in charge. And they had a complicit administration for a period of time. But I do think pulling out that linchpin has really been a game changer. So they're going to put out stuff aimed against what they call disinformation, a unified statement in favor of net zero initiatives. But I don't think it really has much punch left.
Well, they were very active, obviously, for a long time, and there were a lot of stars, I would call them, shooting stars, which have a limited lifespan, as you know, like Greta Thunberg and other people like that, who became celebrities for taking on the climate change hysteria, becoming part of it and promoting it to people on Earth. There were millions of people following these people, like Greta and all these others. They kind of lost their luster, didn't they?
I think they did. But here's the tragic thing. There's an awful long line of victims going back over the past few decades. So it's great to see the wind go out of this, and how knowing and aware Miss Greta is with all this is sort of an open question. I think she's just a bit of a tool, which is sad and unfortunate. But there's a long list of victims. All the people who the UN globalists claim to champion, third world countries, underdeveloped countries, they're the ones who suffer the most from their climate policies, which are really anti-human, anti-energy policies. So even though I think, as I say, the movement's past its peak, there's a train wreck behind us of broken lives, broken businesses, broken property owners, and I hope that we never see a repeat of this again. So there's a serious, unfortunate fallout from what has transpired over the past few decades.
Well, you're right. Of course, it's not gone, because there are still people in our government, bureaucrats, who think they have the right to continue to do all kinds of regulatory things. I know that you and I have lots of friends out west who are in the cattle business and in the ranching business. They're still suffering from rules and regulations that are stupid.
It's going to take a long time to unwind it. At least a certain counter movement has emerged. I do think it's nice timing to have the Trump administration in place on the outer fringes of the anniversary of celebrating American independence, 250 years. Now, I almost like to say what we really should be celebrating that as an effort to try to restore American independence. I think we've actually lost some of it. But if you want to go back and look at some of those folks out west who have been victimized, I think a lot of it begins with this unfortunate relationship that evolved with the United Nations and some of their anti-property rights agendas that have burrowed into this country. A great way to celebrate American independence is by getting out of these agreements, unwinding these executive orders that you've identified. And I have a further step too, that I think could be the coup de grace if we can ever get there. But we can talk about that.
Well, we know from history, if you really know your history, the United Nations was born as a communist front. And they really are. Alger Hiss, one of the primary creators of the UN Charter in the very beginning, was a known, not just a communist sympathizer, he was an agent for the USSR. That was back in the days when there was a USSR.
Sure.
And if you read through that document, the whole goal of the United Nations was to unite the world under a socialist communist governance scheme where we would be pawns and the global elite would be the rulers. Ain't that the truth?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you juxtapose the United Nations charters with the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, you will see that there's no middle ground here. They are diametrically opposed documents. And I think the opportunity here is for the contemporary Americans to go back and develop an understanding of the natural rights underpinning the Declaration of Independence, how it marries into the Constitution, how it's designed to secure these pre-existing natural rights. The United Nations on the opposite side, they want transnationalism and globalism, no room for private property rights, and they don't really hide their agenda. It's out there and all in the open for people to view and see. But we are not going to remain an independent free country if we continue to go down this road with the United Nations. And I see an opportunity to make a clean break, hopefully, within the next few years.
Well, it'd certainly be great if we were not a member. We'd pay a huge portion of their upkeep. They have a beautiful building in New York, which probably could be used for other purposes that are better for the American people. And a group like the United Nations would probably do very well in some underdeveloped country in Africa. It might be a better place for them to have a home, wouldn't you think?
I think so. If they're really champions of the third world, they can go and pull up shop and plant some seeds down there. But like I say, all the policies they advocated have really done a lot of damage, and I think really, really great violence to the freedom and the possibilities of people who are most in need of cheap, affordable energy, most in need of property rights. All the people who they champion are the people they really walk all over.
Yes, the people they champion are the ones that are being hurt most by the policies. That's because that's really their agenda is not really to help those people. Their agenda is to take over control of the world. That's what their policy is, and they don't care who gets in their way. But we have been fighting this battle for a long time in this country, back from the 1990s, primarily, actually way before that. But it really picked up steam under the Clinton administration, as you know. So you can expound, I know, pretty much on what that history is from that era. How did we get from there to where we are now, or not now, but where we were, say, a decade ago when things were going their way and not our way?
Yeah, history comes full circle. We just had this COP conference in Brazil. The first conference, United Nations conference, was in Rio, Brazil, where another Republican president, George Bush Sr., got us involved with that initial climate agreement, whatever they called it back then. It was supposedly non-committal, but we know what non-committal really means. I mean, gradually over time it metastasized. And I think part of what happened, it's not hard to pull back these layers, but a lot of former communists went into the Green parties in Europe and started to push their agenda under a different name. And they saw the climate agenda as sort of the replacement for the supposed collapse of communism at the end of the 80s. I say supposed because it never really goes away. It takes a step back, but it always comes back and repackages itself. Same goal, centralized planning, globalism, but repackaged under like a different name and different marketing concepts. And you think about it, everything sits inside the climate. Everything sits inside the environment. So if you want to regulate and control people, doing it in the name of environmentalism or climate, however you want to describe it, is a great way to do it. There's nothing that's not inside the climate, nothing that's not inside the environment. So if you're a regulator, that's a very smart, savvy way to go about your power grab.
Well, of course, but the climate and climate change is only a tool, as you well know. They use whatever tools they need to with the purpose of taking away land, taking away property rights, taking money and redistributing wealth, mostly into their own pockets, maybe a little bit to some underdeveloped countries. But the UN's history has been no different than what you would find in communist China and communist Russia or any of the other communist countries. All they want to do is take away your rights, your natural law rights, take away your money, take away your freedom. That's what it's all about for them. And fortunately, we have fought back to the point where that whole facade of climate change is crumbling because it was based upon a very false premise that carbon dioxide is a poison gas.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when when the EPA came out with that a couple decades ago, and I was thinking, these people, I thought at first, these people flunked third grade. And then I realized it has nothing to do with this being what they really believe. It's their primary tool for taking away all of the lifestyles of the developed nations, mostly the lifestyles of we the people in America.
Well, the attack on CO2 is an attack on humanity itself. I mean, as you discussed, it's the great elixir of life. There's no life on planet Earth without CO2. It is. That's why it's all an opening to do this book, because at the bottom, this climate movement is an anti-human, anti-population movement. It's a repackaged version of some things we've seen before. Malthusianism would be a term that the idea that there's too many people on the planet. I mean, these things get repackaged and resold over time. But I think that's really what's trailing at the bottom of this. And climate, I think, is just sort of the latest innovation of a movement that has an unfortunate, very long history. And you said it very well. There's no life without CO2. It's not by accident or happenstance that they villainize CO2. That's their rationale for controlling human behavior.
The interesting thing is this is a carbon planet. When you come right down to it, any geologist will tell you that the most important substance on this earth is carbon in one of its many forms. Our DNA is made up of carbon. All energy, and we know, for instance, that there's more energy in a barrel of oil than you can get out of anything comparable. That barrel of oil has an enormous, can do the work of 49 men. That's where energy is the most efficient source of energy. All these windmills and solar panels and whatever else you want to come up with, it doesn't even come close in efficiency to a barrel of oil.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. It's funny, if you take a time to look through these environmental impact statements, just to take like wind power as one example. And, I would say it would be funny if there wasn't such a serious fallout from it. But even no less than the Biden administration, those federal agencies would acknowledge that none of these things are going to have any appreciable impact on climate or, impact at the margins, even though that's how they rationalize it. So it's kind of funny. All the people who I think are genuine conservationists or preservationists who are against the offshore wind, they're squaring off against self-described climate activists who say, well, yes, it might cause some environmental damage, but because of the long-term climate stuff, all these things have to come first, gobbling up the land, destroying the beaches, and having all these eyesores, all done in the name of climate change. So they really tip their hand. Nothing they're advocating and doing is healthy, even by their own metrics. These items are not good for the environment, not even remotely.
Well, the interesting thing, for instance, windmills. I was amazed to learn that the speed of the tip of one of those blades is over 300 miles an hour.
Oh, yeah.
And so it is not even, I don't even have to wonder why birds are being killed. Birds can't fly 300 miles an hour, and they've got this big blade coming after them without them even knowing it. They're chopping the birds up into pieces. But all these environmentalists who were crying about the sage grouse and this bird and that bird and whatever bird, meanwhile they want these windmills that are killing the very animals that they were 30 years ago they were crying to protect.
Right. There was a joke in Searchlight, Nevada, which is the home area of the great Senator Harry Reid, who had his own history with climate activism. And he was all in with the wind power, except he didn't want it built anywhere near his home. So he pushed it out further, so just the little people had to deal with it. And they pushed back very hard. Their comment was there's nothing wrong with wind power aside from physics and economics. Other than that, it works just fine. So fortunately for them, they won that argument. But you don't have to dig too deep to see how hypocritical these political figures are. They'll posture and advocate for all these big boondoggles, so long as it doesn't obstruct their beachfront views or their palatial estates. But I think the bloom has come off the rose a little bit, especially with the wind power and other schemes.
Well, look what the Kennedy family did when they tried to put windmills off Cape Cod, off their where they went sailing. That was their sailing territory, and there the environmentalists want to put up a big windmill farm, and they say, "Oh no, not in my sailing territory. Go put them up somewhere else."
Right.
Yeah, hypocrisy is something to behold, is it not?
Yeah, especially where the climate movement's concerned. I will say just a little bit of good news. I do think there's an honorable tradition of conservation and preservation that predates what I'll call the command and control approach that I think got started sometime in the 70s. And I think it's beginning to reemerge a little bit. I think you see it happening with the battles against offshore wind, wind power on land, these big solar panels that leave all kinds of pollution behind. If we can devolve power, you and I have had long conversations about this, decentralize what I think is sort of a grassroots, genuine environmental movement as it's defined in the dictionary, we might have something there. And I think it's interesting to see this clash between local activists who are genuine conservationists versus the self-described climate activists. That's a very interesting dichotomy that I think is beginning to emerge. Who is really the good guy here? Who really cares about pristine open spaces and well-managed land? It's not the centralized planners, and as you know, it's not the government agencies that own too much of the land out west. They have a poor track record there.
Well, one of the things that I know that you can discuss very well is there's been for a long time, we were the victim of a left-wing judiciary. Mm-hmm. And that is where a lot of the decisions came that promoted all of what's going on here now. But a lot of the judges that were put in by Trump in his first term, they're taking a toll on that attitude, are they not? Why don't you talk about some of the recent decisions that have been very, very favorable to freedom, land ownership, and the like?
I think we're starting to see the early benefits of putting the judiciary back inside of a constitutional box. And I think that's one reason why the left has had such a meltdown over the judiciary. I think one of the big decisions standing out, of course, was the decision to overturn the Chevron doctrine, the idea that elected officials should be deferential to the unelected agencies when it comes to running these regulations. I think that was a huge, significant blow to the administrative state, to the swamp, however you want to describe it. The other decision I don't think gets enough attention is the decision to rein in the NEPA Act, National Environmental Policy Act. That's a longstanding law. I think, again, I'm going to say it goes back to the early 70s, late 60s. That began with various federal projects that said that government agencies had to have some kind of plan to see what the environmental impact was, but of course it metastasized into something very harmful. And I think just those two decisions alone, to rein in NEPA, to overturn Chevron, are real big game changers. It's up to Congress to keep reclaiming its legislative authority, but I think those are very promising developments, and I think that's one of the enduring, lasting changes President Trump has made to put more of a constitutional majority on that court that adjudicates rather than legislates and reins in this unelected fourth branch.
So why don't you explain a little bit, how did the Chevron decision, how does that play out in court cases now versus what was happening prior?
I think it makes it more of a level playing field. I think for average people and for, let's say, legitimate federal projects, whether they're national security initiatives that are always going to have some kind of footprint. But the way the train was set up before under Chevron, whatever the policy views of a particular judge was, that the judge was doing his job, he would say, well, the law is written that we have to defer to the expertise of the agency. Meaning that essentially what was happening is you were allowing the executive to grab more legislative authority outside of the legislative branch, put it inside the executive, so you can coerce all of these pet projects in the name of your climate initiatives. The Chevron doctrine it runs counter to every principle of the American founding. But also, you have to blame Congress in the end for surrendering too much of its authority. I think the great thing about this decision, the courts finally stood up and say, Congress, it's time for you to do your job and make a decision about, saying yay or nay in these regulations. But to answer your question, I think when you go into the courtroom now, you were almost always back on your heels against the administrators and the executive officials. I think suddenly that's no longer the case. I think you have more of a fighting chance because, who makes them the experts?
Well, that was what the problem is.
Yeah.
Well, the issue here is you're talking about litigation that is based upon scientific, if you want to call it an argument or call it a disagreement. And judges are really not capable of understanding a lot of the science from the actual scientific point of view. The Chevron decision allowed a judge just to take the opinion of the agency who had written the rule, which is like, that's like letting the fox in the hen house pretty much, is that the people who wrote the rule are then being relied upon to say, yeah, the rule is right and the science is right, without having a contest in court that in which opposing scientists could come in and show, here are the scientific facts from this whole group of studies that have been done elsewhere. The Chevron decision throws all that out. Now you can actually have that debate in court because the judge can't just say, well, the agency wrote the rules, so they must know what they're doing.
Yeah, I think you explained that very well. And I would say early test cases for the post-Chevron world are in these lawsuits against offshore wind, where the evidence is coming into the courtroom. Before, they could just, say, we're deferring to the agencies and their expertise. And before the argument even got out the door, you were shot down. Now it has an empowering influence on property owners, average citizens, and scientists who have questions about the impact of offshore wind, what it really means for the climate and the environment. In other words, you have a real debate.
Which is what you need.
Yeah.
Because the problem is we are faced with scientists who ignore the scientific method. That's the trap that we got caught in. In 30, 40 years ago, in my early parts of my career, I wrote a lot of peer-reviewed articles for publication in scientific publication. We had to go through a peer-reviewed process on every single article where our peers would say, I'm not sure I believe what you said. I want to see the evidence and explain it to me, before they would let that article go into a journal and be published. So that was in a day when the scientific method was adhered to. In other words, you did an experiment to find out what the results are, not design an experiment to get the results that you want, which is what goes on now. And one of the reasons for that is because money has become involved in science, where corporations and government are purchasing scientific results from so-called reputable institutions, which that ain't science.
No, the process should matter. You're not supposed to have the ending written to please your benefactors, especially your benefactors in government. That's not the scientific method. You put out something that could be falsifiable, that's open to scrutiny, and let the theory rise and fall in its own weight. Not where I write the ending so I can justify your regulation and then I'll rationalize it any old which way. I think that sort of backs into what we saw with the ClimateGate scandal, which I think is having an anniversary date coming up soon. But the whole idea where in these email exchanges, the academics, I don't like to even call them scientists. I think I'll call them academics and political activists, were willingly cooking the books to get the results they wanted. And like I say, it would be funny if but not for how expensive it all is for the rest of us.
Well, you look, for instance, at the original hockey stick graph, which was one of the early so-called scientific truths upon which the whole climate theory relied. He completely ignored the medieval warm period.
Right.
And if you know your history, you know that during the medieval warm period, the Vikings had farms and farm animals. They grew crops in Greenland, which is now covered by a glacier 2 miles thick. And
Right.
grapes were grown in northern England in areas that cannot support the growth of grapes now. That was the medieval warm period. There's been an enormous amount of climate change since. Not to mention the fact that where we are sitting right now, both you and I, 20,000 years ago, and 20,000 years ago is just a blip in the history of Earth. But 20,000 years ago, this area was covered by a glacier 2 miles thick, and it's gone. And it's not because dinosaurs were driving around in SUVs.
Oh, right.
I mean,
Right.
really, climate change is part of the life of this planet in our solar system, and it's dependent not on anything that you or I do or anyone else. It has to do with a lot of things that are way beyond our control. Which brings up the absolute point: is all this government funding should be spent to help us adapt to whatever climate change, not try to stop something we can't stop.
The climate's always changing, and there's always going to be challenges to humanity. But I ask this as the climate activist: aren't we going to be in a better position to confront those challenges if we're richer and wealthier? Not if we deindustrialize, not if we make ourselves poor. You're suddenly going to be more vulnerable to weather events or tornadoes or what have you. Not if you unleash technology. The evidence is that it'll be better for poorer populations. We'll be better equipped to encounter whatever challenges we face. But by the way, I should also say the mild warming, and by geological standards, this has been a relatively mild warming period. It's actually yielded some tangible benefits in terms of animal and plant life. So the whole premise is wrong. I don't think it's necessarily follows that the recent warming period has been harmful at all. I think, if anything, it's actually been beneficial for human life, beneficial for plant life. But certainly going forward, we could be heading back into a cooling period. There are astronomers who say we have a less active sun. Next 20 or 30 years, maybe we're heading into a mini ice age. We don't know. But to your point, we don't really control any of it. I think, look to astronomy to see what the real influences on climate are. But you make us all poorer, we go back into teepees, we're not going to be able to handle any kind of climate change that's coming up. So just, you don't have to burn too many brain cells to discover that their solutions are suicide.
Well, in addition, of course, carbon dioxide is directly related to growth of plants.
Right.
The higher the CO2 content of the atmosphere, the better the plants grow. The lower it is, the worse they grow. So we're now currently around 440 parts per million. That's about okay. We go up another 100 or so, we'll be able to feed an awful lot more people because plants will prosper from carbon dioxide. They need it just like we need the oxygen that they give off for us.
Well, you mentioned the key phrase adaptability, and somebody who would agree with you suddenly is Bill Gates, who a longtime climate activist who, to his credit, I think has come around a bit to say, even if you sort of accept the premise that there's some kind of deleterious impact from human activity, the best thing we can do is adapt to it and address questions of poverty and try to lift up people. Now, I'm much more of a skeptic on the science than he is, but I think it's interesting that some of these major longtime activist personalities are making a 180. And I think there's a reason for that. I think that the movement is finally beginning to run out of steam.
I agree with you that the movement is running out of steam, but I would not be so kind to Bill Gates. I don't think he's doing anything at all if it's not going to earn him money.
Okay, fair enough. But it's interesting that he felt a need to come around a little bit.
Right, because there's dollars and cents in it for him.
Right.
You look at, here's a man who profited from the American free market system.
Sure.
And I am delighted. I love the free market. I'm a free market guy. Make as much money as you want, as long as you don't do it fraudulently.
Right.
You do it honestly, you can make as much as you want. But then what you need to do is go buy an island, go live on it, enjoy your life, and don't use your money to try to change the lives and affect the lives of other people. Tell them how they should live because you want them to live that way. And that's what Bill Gates has been doing. He's taken his fortune, and instead of going and minding his own business, he's been intent on telling you and me what he thinks is our ideal lifestyle and how we should live. I object to that very, very strenuously. I think he's been involved in a lot of things that have been very deleterious to human life. There may be arguments about how much he did and how much he didn't do. But I think if you really examine Bill Gates, you will not you will not give him as much credit as you have.
Okay, fair enough. You want to put the villain hat on him.
I definitely will put the villain hat on him.
Okay. I take it as a sign of progress that he's felt a need to say what he said publicly, but maybe he's doing it for cynical reasons. Just like maybe Bill Clinton signed off on welfare reform for cynical reasons. I was still glad he did it, but I think it's looking up in the air and seeing which way the wind is blowing.
So one of the things that you wrote about in your book, and I think you should discuss that, and that is victims. Of all of these, there have been a huge number of victims from the whole climate change movement. Why don't you give us some time on what you have discovered with your investigative reporting? Because you've gone into it very deeply, I know.
Yeah, unfortunately, there are some permanent victims, people who will never quite get their lives and the stature back that they used to. I have a whole chapter on these RICO prosecutions. That was an effort by, if you remember, Eric Schneiderman, the New York Attorney General, joined forces with Al Gore, taking inspiration from Sheldon Whitehouse, the big climate activist U.S. Senator in Rhode Island, to put together a legal strategy for actually trying to impose criminal penalties on honest scientists, honest academics, people in media, people in government who are willing to challenge the climate narrative. And unfortunately, they were able to force people out of certain positions, people forced out of government jobs because they didn't toe the line. And, some of them get back up on their feet, but some of them, have not been able to. And their story needs to be told. I try to do that very powerfully by putting some real personality into the book. Who are these people? Who are the people in academia and in government who are willing to speak out? And also, where do we sit now in terms of academia and government? So I think when you want to talk about victims, go there. Look at the academic institutions and also in government to see people who have been ostracized and forced out, deplatformed and marginalized because they didn't want to toe the line on climate. And then there are average business owners and property owners who have lost their livelihood in the name of climate change. Some have been able to fight back very effectively, but not everybody has the means and the organization and support to do that. So I do have several chapters in here telling those stories of just average people, your friends, your neighbors, who have been deplatformed and silenced and lost their livelihood because of this climate, what I call the climate industrial complex. So even though, like I say, the wind is starting to go out of that movement, there's a permanent class of victims who are never going to quite get back to the positions they were previously, and their stories need to be told.
Well, one of the other things, and that is very important to me, because those people have grievances, and those grievances will never be satisfied. There's absolutely no way for them to get back what they have lost. They are victims of Bill Gates and the other people who have tons and tons of money, who never, Al Gore and George Soros, people like that, who never, ever have to worry for the rest of their lives what they do. There are people that they victimized, and those people will never get their lives back, will never get their farms back,
Nope.
their homes back. And from our friends of ours out west who deal with this on a constant day-to-day basis, when a little flood comes and washes out a little bridge over a 3-foot creek, and the EPA comes and says, no, I'm sorry, you can't rebuild that bridge, and your cattle can't walk through the creek. These are the things that go on in the day-to-day lives of people all over the United States. And they're still trying to do things like that, grab lands for transmission corridors. That was another thing. The Antiquities Act, which is totally abused by the federal government. And real people, real people like you and me, if we are involved in that, we get harmed. We have agreements that can never be satisfied.
Yeah, I think, and a big part of the problem is how well dialed in all these different climate groups and green groups are in all levels of government. That was a gradual process that I think began in probably, I'm going to say sometime in the 70s. I think it's all this sort of cascaded after the first Earth Day, getting control of all these different government agencies. But you'll find that if you're squaring off an environmental activist group, you'll find they're actually synonymous with your government agency. There's an incestuous relationship there, which I think only recently we've started to sort of push back against, which is why I think some of these early movements by the Trump administration are very encouraging, but it's going to take an awfully long time to unwind this. So you still have this sort of unelected administrative, I'll call it climate activist branch. What did the Biden administration call it? The all of the above approach to climate, where every government agency was in on this. And they meant it. Every single federal agency had some kind of climate initiative. So if you were a landowner, business owner, go down the list, you had a dispute with a climate activist group or a green activist group. They really were a stand-in for government officials who are supposed to be looking out for the public interest, when in fact they are one and the same with the green activists. And that's a long battle we still need to fight.
So how about one of the things that I know that you have looked into is energy prices in red states versus blue states. And that's pretty telling from what I gather.
Absolutely. You mentioned the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative earlier. And there's nothing like a little bit of reality to settle in. Josh Shapiro is governor of the big energy exporting state in Pennsylvania, and he's looking at competitors out south and Midwest who are trying to pull in business. And he's saying, I can't be competitive with these southern red states or other red states if I remain part of this package, this carbon tax cap and trade scheme. So there's no natural process of osmosis at work when you're talking about red states versus blue states. It is deliberate acts of public policy. Reggie's just one of several examples. I think you think of Reggie as sort of like a local version of the Paris Agreement, like a cap and trade that is burrowed into the New England area of the United States. But you break orbit from Reggie, and get out into the free America where you don't have these cap and trade agreements. Energy companies have more latitude to operate. Supply and demand is able to flow naturally. And lo and behold, you have lower energy prices. And there's just no debating it.
How about gas? We all depend on gas and diesel fuel for our lives. Everything that we do includes shopping, going to the grocery market or the food store, or driving our own vehicles. There is a big disparity between red states and blue states.
That's one reason why these carbon tax plans are so extreme. Like, I call it cap and trade with the Reggie stuff, but it really is built around carbon taxes. And it's really a tax on every human activity imaginable. You get in your car to go out and buy cereal at the store, you pay carbon taxes. You want to go to a baseball game, you pay carbon taxes. You take 2 steps, you pay carbon taxes. Again, it's back to carbon. How can we really sock it to average people? How can we empower centralized planners? And that's what carbon taxation is all about.
True. And again, it's victims like you and me. We have become victims at all levels. And I think a lot of people don't really understand how extensive the tentacles of this bureaucracy are when it comes to what they have done to you and me and our fellow citizens, all in the name of something which is totally fake.
I think to break it down as simply as I can, we're talking about the collapse of constitutional government. There's that fourth branch that has emerged. We call it the swamp, but I think the climate industrial complex is part of what built that fourth branch. You go through all the regulations that have impacted the private sector, emerging over the past few decades, all done in the name of climate. And which is why I think these court decisions that we discussed a little earlier are so important. I see that as an early incremental step toward correcting that. That's encouraging. That's promising. Putting this beast back in a box, but it's going to take a long time to unwind it, and it's going to take a lot of political will. Supreme Court decisions are not self-executing. It comes down to what I'll call constitutional activism. We need more of our own litigants, more of our own people going to court to fight these battles, since we can bring evidence in the way we didn't used to. That's the way to really fight the fourth branch. So it's up to more activism on our end to take advantage of this opening that we have. That's not going to stay there just through some natural process. We have to really exploit it.
Well, the problem with bureaucracy is it's made up of people who have an enormous amount of power, and we can't do anything to oppose them directly. They are not elected. They are appointed. We cannot take them out of office. We cannot put people in the bureaucratic office that we want. We can't examine what they're for and what they're against. But on the other hand, look at all the things, all the parts of our lives that they can control. And we have not a single thing that we can do about it.
Well, I think repealing that executive order from Bill Clinton's era, I think, is a good start, because I think that'll pull the linchpin out from what's happening at the state level. All these things done in the name of Agenda 21, going back to that first Rio summit, and sustainable development. I think that's one thing we can push to do. That's an achievable goal, to really roll back these initiatives. It could really be the coup de grace against this movement, I think.
Well, talking about that is something I'm obviously very much in favor about. And you're talking about repealing Clinton's Executive Order 12852 on sustainable development.
Right.
That is a Clinton-era executive order. He founded with that executive order the President's Council on Sustainable Development. And that was in June of 1993. And what that order did is it formed this council of people who came to meet together, and they met for over a year. The interesting thing about them, there were 32 total members of the President's Council on Sustainable Development. 12 were from federal agencies controlled by Democrats, and 8 were from private, well-funded liberal organizations, which are still active today, such as World Resources Institute, National Resources Defense Council, Center for Neighborhood Technology, Women's Environmental and Development Organization, Environmental Defense Fund, the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy. So 20 out of the 32 people on the President's Council, 20 of them were in the tank for the Green Initiative, for Agenda 21. This executive order is still relied upon by bureaucrats because it's still in effect. The council is gone, but that executive order has never been repealed. And so in the states, some of the state agencies, they look at this order and they say, well, that order says we can do this.
Right.
And they use that as the basis for doing it. So a presidential executive order becomes the source of policy agendas, rules, and regulations created by federal and state bureaucracies, because the states enact statutes and policies to receive federal grant funds that are based on those very regulations. And that's kind of the trap that we're in. And that's why it would be a very simple thing for President Trump to rescind that order, repeal Clinton's Executive Order 12852. That would remove the foundation for a lot of the regulations that are abusing the American people.
Yeah, it would open a door for that state level activism that I'd like to see. The only thing that really prevents what I'll call sort of like a federalist state local revolution from really pushing back hard against this is that executive order. As long as that's in place, these agencies can look over their shoulder and say, we've got this standing behind us. And unfortunately, that makes it a very sticky, kind of tricky situation. And even though we have an administration that's not really giving life to it, it still provides the architecture for a lot of these damaging policies.
So my suggestion is, you guys listening to us talk, write a letter, call the president, tell him Clinton's executive order 12852 from 1993 needs to be repealed. It is the foundation for climate change hysteria and all the bad things that have happened to you and me as a result. I know you're on board with that, Kevin.
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to keep writing about it, keep exposing it. I think it's important to focus on achievable goals over the next 2 years. That certainly is one of them. But mine is the other item is that what you mentioned sort of at the top of the discussion is unwinding the endangerment finding. If the administration is successful in that effort, I think that one action alone will make the entire Trump presidency worthwhile. Pulling out that edifice behind all the regulations that have gone in place in the name of climate change. And it's a good 1-2 punch. Lee Zeldin's doing everything, I think, in terms of regulatory maneuvers. What doesn't get enough attention is a report that Chris Wright put out at the Department of Energy, taking on the science behind the demonization of CO2. Where you have 5 or 6 very top-of-the-line scientists going through this very carefully, saying that all the nonsense about climate change is overstated. There's a real debate about what's causing it. There's natural influences. And it's really fun to watch the climate activists have a meltdown over, usually we're the ones complaining about reports coming out of government agencies, but I sort of like being on the other side of that conversation where I'm applauding what the Energy Department is doing and giving voice to these scientists who are willing to speak out.
Well, that, Kevin, is one of the things that we can work for. We can talk about. We can ask people to help us do this, because you have to get off the sofa. Now is our opportunity to take control of our constitutional lives. Because, Kevin, you were right. We have departed from the constitutional republic that was given to us 250 years ago, and the bureaucracy is one of the primary causes. The second cause, of course, is corporate money in politics. It's a disaster. It's a corruption. It's a corrupting influence that is beyond imagination. If you run for Senate and you spend $190 million to get elected, you are spending $190 million for a job that pays $175,000 for 6 years. That, to me, is blanket proof of corruption, because no one is going to spend that amount of money if they don't expect to get something back.
Oh, sure. And that fourth branch of government is the ultimate platform for all of this to happen. One thing I'd like to invite you, this astute audience of yours I know is on top of this, but I think this opportunity with 250 years, I tell people, go back and read the Declaration of Independence. Go back to the preamble. Look at the complaints against King George III. Substitute the pronoun he for they, and all those complaints against the king can be turned back on those bureaucrats inside what I call the fourth branch of government. Learn what the connection is between the Declaration and the Constitution, the structure of the Constitution. Zimbabwe has a Bill of Rights. They have a free speech thing, but it doesn't mean anything because there's no structure, no separation of powers like we have, giving life to the Bill of Rights. And I think that's what people lose. A lot of Americans, when you ask about the Constitution, they'll pull something out of the Bill of Rights, but I'll say, well, it's really the structure of the Constitution that gives life to the Bill of Rights. Remember, Hamilton didn't want a bill. He said the Constitution is a Bill of Rights, and he was right. But I think more importantly, go back to the Declaration of Independence as the organic fundamental law of this country. If we do that, we cannot stay part of the United Nations. And I think that we can begin that collapse of the kind of globalism you and I have complained about.
I think that's a very true statement. I look at the three documents, our three founding documents. The Declaration of Independence, it's a statement of our philosophy. The Constitution is kind of the shop manual of how the government should work. But the Bill of Rights, to me, is the most important because that establishes the relationship of each individual person and each state to the federal government. That the Bill of Rights is one of the most important documents that we need to rely on. We can stand on that document to demand our rights back, whether we're asking for a redress of grievances under the First Amendment, or whether we're seeking protection in a court of law with the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, and of course the Second Amendment being the most important, because without the Second Amendment, the entire Constitution is meaningless. All of the founders understood that. That was not in there by a mistake. And when you come to the bureaucracy, I want to remind everyone that the very first sentence in Article 1, Section 1 about Congress is that all legislative power resides in a Congress of the United States. That's about as clear a statement as I can read or understand. There's no misconception there. So when the bureaucrats are busy making law, it is not constitutional. Those laws need to be made by acts of Congress. Congress cannot delegate. There's nowhere in there where it says Congress can delegate that authority to a group of unelected bureaucrats.
It's not by accident that Congress is in Article 1. The preeminent branch. I fear that if the Constitution were done today, Article 1 would be some kind of unelected agency or the imperial judiciary. Let's get back to having Congress as the lawmaking body. I will say, if you read through the Federalist Papers, they make the point that we'll have this healthy tension between the branches as all jealously guard their power. But oddly enough, Congress willingly gave up some of its power to these unelected administrative agencies. Maybe what we need today is to pay attention to the anti-federalists a little bit, because we wouldn't have a Bill of Rights without the anti-federalists. They deserve a little bit of kudos these days.
And thank God that Bill of Rights was actually written down and added to the Constitution. You can imagine what would be happening if it weren't written down in stone. But what I'd like to remind people is that we're talking with Kevin Mooney. Kevin is a very accomplished author. He has a book coming out after the first of the year, which I think you should. And what was the name of that book again? I want you to say the title for me.
Okay. Well, you have to have my humor for this, and there's a reason for it. But the title is Climate Porn. And there's a longer subtitle, which I don't have in front of me, but it gets into American independence.
Right. So that's a good point. And actually, I'm going to find that subtitle because I think that subtitle is very good. Let me get to it here.
Yeah.
Yes. So it is, and I'm going to get to it right here. Yes. So it's Climate Porn, How and Why Anti-Population Zealots Fabricate Science While Targeting American Capitalism, Freedom, and Independence. Well, that says a mouthful, Kevin.
It does. The original version of that was a little bit longer, but the publisher got me to condense it. I refused to give up too much ground, so that was a compromise. I could have had more descriptions there.
And I want everyone to realize that you can go and find some of the wonderful things that Kevin run for articles of very excellent investigative reporting that Kevin has done on Restoration News. Their website is restoration-news.com, and then search for Kevin Mooney. And then you will find him a whole bunch of articles, many of whom I've read, and I'm always impressed, Kevin, with what you're writing. So we've had an incredible discussion. How would you like to say goodbye?
I'll just say it's easy to be dour, but I believe in American renewal. We have sources for renewal that are not available in Europe. And I think the idea of the natural law, getting back to originalist jurisprudence, and reawakening the American populace on the eve of 250 years about how dangerous these globalists are, how damaging the climate movement has been to average people. Either this is going to be a temporary course change, or it might be a speed bump along the way to the end of the republic. I don't know the answer to that yet.
And so I will sum up by saying, get off the sofa and speak up. Resist tyranny and trust in freedom. Good night, y'all. Good night, Kevin. Thank you for being a fantastic guest.
Thanks for having me.
Freedom Forum Live every Tuesday night, 8 p.m. Eastern Time.